He becomes the top general in the demon's army, but hides it from everyone. If you dig my recaps, don't forget to subscribe and smash that notification bell. In the dim light of a dusty library, a girl picks up a book that tells the story of a sorcerer named Ike who served in the army of the demon lord and was the grandson of Romberg, the master sorcerer. As one of the leaders among those hordes of orcs and monstrous creatures, alongside his assistant Jiron, Ike would charge into enemies with fierce resolve, while hiding a secret from the demons that could cost him not only his prestige as commander of the Immortal Brigade, but also his very life. Inside one of the castles captured by the 7th Battalion, a human commander receives the bitter visit of Ike in his quarters. Facing the defeated human, Ike presents 3 options. The first is to surrender and hand over all his territory. The second is to die by his own hand in an act of honor. Lastly, the commander can flee through the window while the demon pretends to admire the scene of annihilation outside. Ironically, the human thanks his enemy for the mercy, but states that none of the options are sufficient for him. As expected, the man attacks the opposing leader, who retaliates with a single spell that ends the battle. Ike then orders Jiron to tend to the defeated commander's wounds as well as those of his soldiers who surrendered. Observing the war from afar through a magical sphere, a sorceress notes that it took only a week for the brigade to conquer Arsenam, an undeniable proof of the commanding talent behind the victory. With his scepter in hand, Ike conjures a magical barrier at the battle's end. Gazing upon the scene of devastation, he cannot help but feel guilty for wounding so many people, knowing he will never get used to the blood and violence of war. After all, Ike was never a demon, but shares the race targeted by his brutal offensives, human. His teacher Romberg was a great sorcerer with vast wisdom, who understood everything about the advanced civilization that once thrived in this world. On a whim, he decided to take in and raise Ike, a human child, and taught him all his knowledge and magic. In his last words, the sage asked Ike never to speak of the lost civilization, as such a revelation would one day bring countless disasters. As a burden to keep this secret, Ike could never remove the cloak and mask he must wear to hide his true identity, for Romberg knew the demon lord would never forgive Ike's humanity. Years later, after conquering Arsenam, Ike surrounds the room with a powerful barrier, granting him control over who could enter. At least that was the plan. To his surprise, a young maid had been hiding under the office desk. Begging for her life, the girl swears she saw nothing of what happened, but her desperate clumsiness seemed more hostile to her survival than the powerful enemy sorcerer. After 20 years of keeping his secret, Ike had been discovered by a hapless human who had knocked herself out on the desk. Later, walking among the ruined halls of that civilization, Jiron fears that too many humans have been left alive. In his defense, Ike argues that a dead man cannot pay taxes, nor can he keep the machinery of Arsenam running, a city renowned for its highly developed commerce. Speaking of which, a little further along, surrendered residents want to know how much they owe in taxes to the demon lord. To the workers' delight, the sorcerer informs them that the rate will remain the same, but warns that anyone who resists this demand will be punished exemplarily. Suddenly, Ike is summoned without his consent to a chamber where a gigantic golem attacks him. Realizing what's happening, the sorcerer comments to his commander that she promised not to teleport him without warning. Ignoring her subordinate, the mage watches the confrontation in silence. Not taking it lightly, Ike wields his scepter to unleash the slashing attack against the enemy, destroying the golem. Having done this, his superior recalls the little boy who used to hide behind his grandfather, the master sorcerer Romberg. Now Ike was strong enough to defeat a creature she believed could rival him. However, Zephyr, the commander of the 7th Battalion, not only understood the current power of the mage, but was also the only demon who knew his secret. As flamboyant as ever, she informs Ike that Darakutan wishes to see him personally, making him the first brigade leader to receive such an honor. Thus, she will take him to the demon lord's castle immediately. Meanwhile, the maid wakes up after fainting from the blow to her head. Not understanding what is happening, she is prevented from leaving the room by the magical barrier, so she turns her eyes back to the room until she finds a portion of food with a note. The message asks the girl to eat and keep quiet, which she does not comprehend at first, but hunger makes her devour the food. Returning to Ike standing before that castle surrounded by miasma, the dark mass affects the human's body, as it always has, regardless of how many years he has been in contact with every corner of the demon territory. As if that weren't enough this time, he would undergo an evaluation to meet the demon lord, which could reveal his true identity. However, to prevent this, Zephyr casts a spell spell that promises to maintain the man's disguise. Then, before the commander responsible for inspecting the castle, Ike exudes extraordinary power, prompting the inspector to comment that he expected nothing less from Romberg's grandson. With this, Ike gains access to Doberberg, the demon lord's enormous castle, built to express the vast influence and power of the lord. The corridors are vast and endless, giving the human mage the impression that the supreme leader's importance is just as immense. However, the clear disadvantage of this extensive path is the fact that it tires humans like Ike, who envies his commander's flying ability as she glides through the fortress's corridors without feeling the weight of her steps. Even though he can use this spell, Ike does not control it, as well as Zephyr managing only to leap to great heights instead of gracefully floating without tiring his legs in long walks like the demon does. So after some time, the commander of the Immortal Brigade finally arrives in the throne room of the current demon lord. At the forefront of the hordes, Derakuten was responsible for turning the tide of war against humanity with just one battle. And this reputation makes both enemies and allies fear the coldness and cruelty of this demon, known for executing anyone he considers incompetent, even if they are on his side in the trenches of conflict. On the other hand, Derakuten knows how to best use those who show real talent, and this ability is the hallmark that ensured the demon lord a true revolution in combat methods during his reign. After all, monsters are born and grow up being extremely individualistic, which has always led to endless disputes among them throughout history. However, Derakuten turned the tables by instilling a sense of unity in his troops never seen before, and Ike is about to understand the reason behind this invaluable reputation of the leader. Thus, he bows before the Dark Lord, a young girl who surprises the commander with an appearance that gives an impression of a certain fragility. Derakuten mentions the conquest of the powerful fortress city of Arsenam in just 1 week, and Ike gives all the credit to his superior Saphiro, prompting Derakuten to remark that such humility sounds almost human. This comment sends a chill down the man's spine, so his commander steps in to clarify that she brought the grandson of Romberg, whom everyone called the Guardian of Hell. This information calms the accusatory tone of the demon lord, who understands that this young man's modesty must have come from his grandfather. Speaking of modesty, the Dark Lord emphasizes that Arsenam was taken with almost no loss of life, making Ike think he should have listened to Jiron about killing some prisoners. He quickly considers the best response to justify the lack of bloodshed in the fortress city's battle, arguing that humans may fear terror, but they will never obey it, and history itself proves this. When comparing the productivity of cities where the leaders were executed with those where they remained active, the better approach becomes clear. Without moving a muscle in his face during this speech, Derakuten asks if this is how Romberg thought, which his grandson confirms. With that said, even though he has exchanged few words with the demon lord, Ike has a strange certainty that she knows ancient civilization just like his master, because only knowledge of this level could revolutionize the demon army. Next, Derakuten approaches the servant and considers him different from the other demons who have bloodlust in their eyes. Therefore, next time the Dark Lord wants to look directly at the commander's face to know what kind of thirst this eccentric sorcerer hides behind the mask. With that said, she leaves the throne room. Thus, the human feels brutally relieved, sensing that he could be discovered at any moment, and removes the mask to take a deep breath. With a smile on her face, Saphiro comments that it's not like the man to seem so tense, and he responds that the Lord knew it was a mask, which made him fear immediately. Regardless, his commander reminds him that the human's identity remains preserved, and that's what matters. She informs him that Derakuten gave Ike a reward, which could be seen as a punishment depending on the point of view. Following that, he teleports back to the commander's room in Arsenam, where the portion of food he had left had been devoured by the maid, who slept like a log after eating. Ike kicks the chair where the girl was napping, waking her up with the same fear as last time, pleading not to be killed. Then Ike calms the girl down, saying he won't kill her, and asks for her name to break the ice. The maid says her name is 13, which the mage finds peculiar. However, she explains that servants are called by numbers, and her birth name is Sadie, like that French classical pianist. Some people confuse it with 7, which is not not her number, but the correct pronunciation is Satier, which is not a number at all and sounds much fancier. Regardless, Ike spares the poor girl by making her his servant. In the next scene, the mage is congratulated by Jiron for becoming the Lord of Avelias, the land at the southernmost border of Arsenal. According to Saphiro earlier, this is the Demon Lord's gift to the victorious commander, who now has the opportunity to be on the front line against humans. And since Ike is a lover of taxes, the supreme leader demands that the officer double the tax revenue in the region that sits in the eye of the hurricane in the middle of a war. Curiously, it was the demons who devastated this god-forsaken territory, and now Ike will have to figure out how to rebuild the small town of Avelias, which would take about 6 months, since the place is on the border and will be the target of frequent attacks. The population and the army already begin to feel the influence of the new ruler, who orders humans and demons to work together to rebuild the structures, which would reduce the reconstruction time to just 1 month. Jiron despises the fact that he has to cooperate with this race, especially since the men receive overtime as an incentive. However, the orc acknowledges that his commander's methods are strange, but they earn the title of ruler for the mage, who also gets his hands dirty alongside the workers and is already being recognized by all the local people. In fact, on further reflection, Jiron praises Ike so much that he sees the sorcerer as the future demon lord himself. In the next scene, another battle between humans and demons unfolds, where mages try to hold off the endless hordes invading their territory. One of them thinks it's enough to hurl multiple fire spells as a team hitting the rows of monsters. However, these evil beings appear unscathed even after enduring such high-level magic. In no time, the city walls are breached, and the two forces clash physically, with the demons gaining the upper hand over the humans, as has been frequently happening. In the Demon Lord's castle, Daracuden receives news that the war against Rosaria is going well, but this region plans to form alliances with neighboring countries to mount a stronger resistance. Observing the tendency of humans to unite in the face of difficulty, the Lord decides to leave this problem in Ike's hands. While handling Avelias' bureaucratic matters, the sorcerer receives tea from his newest maid Sadie, who is worried that her master is tired. Politely, the man accepts the gesture and keeps his focus on his tasks. On the other side of the trench, Alistair, leader of the Order of the White Rose Knights, is summoned to retake Avelias, as her superior deems the loss of that territory humiliating and believes it is high time to stop letting the enemies underestimate humans. Meanwhile, in some alley of Avelias, a trickster promises to double the bet for anyone who can guess under which cup the ball is hidden, the typical scam game. With nothing else to do, Sadie decides to take a guess and points to one of the cups. But since she has no money to bet, the game master gets irritated and yells at her. However, upon seeing the good heart the girl has between her shoulders and belly, he suggests she bet something else instead of money, maybe something more physical. But before anything can happen, some spell lifts all 3 cups simultaneously, revealing that the ball was under none of them, causing those who lost money in the scam to demand retribution through violence. In the midst of this, Ike appears in the crowd without his disguise, stating he is on a mission to infiltrate among humans and observe them as enemies. Finding his servant, he orders her to follow him, and as some Avelia's troops patrolled the city streets in a strange formation, the mage comments that the story about the King's Alliance seems true. Sadie asks what that is, and he explains it is an ancient alliance where countries unite in times of danger, setting aside their individual interests to prioritize the common good. This alliance has been activated 3 times in the past, and each time the Demon Lord was defeated with his forces pushed back to the depths of Doderberg. Curiously, his maid becomes downcast upon hearing this, prompting Ike to ask why she is sad about a possible human victory. She reveals that in human society, a slave is always a slave, so if Ike disappears, the girl will likely end up on the streets, becoming a bargaining chip for some servant trader. Hearing this, Ike comforts her, saying that the current Demon Lord is the strongest and wisest in history, ensuring their victory is certain. After speaking, he reflects that both humans and demons have numerous problems and wonders if there is any way to change this once and for all. Suddenly, the scammer from the cup game returns to confront Sadie, accusing her of performing the trick that lifted the cups. Beside him, a gigantic brute ready to teach the meddler a lesson. Sadie argues that the man cheated, but he doesn't care about that. He just wants to recover his loss, be it money or whatever the girl can offer beyond that. Without being invited into the conversation, Ike looks around and sees no one else nearby. Thus, he freezes the brute's legs and summons sharp ice lances that float in the air, poised for the men's first abrupt move. Next, he tries to question the scammer, but the man wouldn't shut up for even a second, so the mage drives a lance into his arm to convince him to be quiet. Ike then mentions the agitation of the local army and wants to know what the soldiers are talking about. The scammer tries to convince the mage that he knows nothing, but Ike threatens him once more, this time with death. With nowhere to run, the man informs that the king's alliance is about to be formed by neighboring countries to fight the demons, and that Rosaria's army plans to attack the demon lord's forces before this alliance is sealed. Ike interprets this move by Rosaria as an attempt to expand its influence within the alliance, granting the country more prestige before the war table is set, which will give them more voice in strategic decisions. On the other hand, of course, if Rosaria fails, it will leave that region in a very delicate situation. Finally, the man reveals that Avelias will be the target of this offensive because the gates are destroyed and the city is poorly defended. Having obtained the information he wanted, Ike turns and leaves the two men trapped in the ice. Returning to his office, the Lord of Avelias is surprised by a visit from Lilith, an old friend who complains about not finding her companion anywhere. Ike explains that he was exploring Rosaria in search of valuable information and was about to reveal it to her, but she interrupts by asking who the woman beside the commander is. As soon as Sadie introduces herself, Lilith calls her ugly and demands the sorcerer relinquish this human, declaring that she will be his maid instead. Moreover, she makes it clear that Sadie must never flirt with the master. Mockingly, Sadie retorts, asking how that could be possible since she is supposedly ugly. Additionally, she says she was legitimately chosen to be Ike's servant. This said, Lilith loses her patience, and the two start a fight just as Jiron arrives and notices the brawl in the office. At the end of the afternoon, doing their best to avoid making noise, the troops of Rosaria gather around Avelias to launch a surprise attack. One of the soldiers involved in the operation notes that the silence is eerie, and so far not a single local guard has been seen anywhere. Soon enough, the catapults are ready for the attack, but just as they receive the order to fire, the humans are taken aback by skeletons rising from the ground and goblin archers lying in wait in the mountains. Realizing his troops are being quickly overrun, Alistair orders his soldiers to retreat. From atop the walls of Avelias, Jiron comments to Ike that the enemy commander's decision was wise, all thanks to the espionage efforts of their master. However, not everything went as planned, and hidden high within the city's structures, a mysterious archer shoots the mage in the back, knocking him down instantly. Later, upon hearing the news of the White Rose Knight's retreat, the superior officer of Rosaria is outraged and orders the arrest of the commander. The soldier receiving the order questions the decision, noting that Alistair is one of the nation's best generals, and this will impact the army's morale. Nevertheless, the officer makes it clear he doesn't care because he needs to uphold his honor by punishing the one responsible for the failure, as this is the only way he will have credit with the king. Meanwhile, Ike wakes up in his bed bandaged and without his disguise, with Saphiro lying beside him. The boy asks what's going on, and the sorceress questions if this is how he talks to the person who just saved his life. Moreover, to further confuse the boy, she points out that he groped her quite eagerly the previous night. After the initial shock, Ike seems to remember nothing of what happened, so Saphiro explains that she healed him from an arrow wound. Aside from that, she mentions that no humans were killed during the battle, and she wants to know what Ike will do if the demon lord suspects him again. Without giving a direct answer, the man says he intends to make humans and demons live together, and that no one will take that idea out of his head. Unsure of how to respond, Saphiro leaves after reminding Ike that he is human and should rest. Alone, the mage examines the arrow that was shot at him and wonders if someone has infiltrated his troops. Shortly after, he quickly puts his disguise back on because Lilith arrives, happy to see the commander is better. Behind her, Sadie shows the same joy, so the demon starts to hiss at her again, trying to make the human keep her distance. Sadie takes the bait, and the two start round 2 until Jiron throws Lilith out and stands in front of the door to keep her from coming back in. Sadie thanks him, calling the orc Mr. Ugly, which offends him, so Ike corrects her, saying the pig isn't that ugly, just has a rustic face and a chubby body out of the ordinary. That said, the master asks Jiron to locate the commander of the White Rose Knights. Sometime later, after his loyal assistant completes his espionage work, the commander of the Immortal Brigade is informed that Alistair was imprisoned after failing the attack on Avelias, so he heads to the prison where she is. To further annoy the man Lilith Lilith once again interferes, making jokes about terrible humans being in that tower, so Ike loses his patience with her and warns that he didn't call for anyone. Persistent, she replies that being alone is too boring, so the mage relents once more as long as the demon keeps quiet. Satisfied, Lilith follows along with her head resting on the poor man's shoulder. Upon reaching the prison gate, the monster remarks that it's easy to get in since there are few guards, but Ike wants to cause as little commotion as possible, acting stealthily. However, in the middle of this, Lilith knocks out the guards, clearing the way. Once inside, the prison is enormous, much larger than Ike had imagined. For this reason, he assumes it will take some time to find the human commander. But Lilith beats her chest again and resolves the situation by knocking out another guard, stealing the key, and getting the information that the prisoner is on the top floor. The mage questions the part about not causing trouble, but doesn't have the patience to scold his companion again, so he continues without saying anything. Suddenly, the situation worsens when other soldiers arrive and attack the two without hesitation. As calm as ever, Lilith hands the keys to her partner and asks him to go ahead while she deals with the problem. For the last time, Ike insists that she doesn't shed unnecessary blood, and in the blink of an eye, she has fractured 14 of the opponent's bones. Ike pretends not to see anything and continues his journey. Upon reaching the mentioned cell, he turns the key and opens the door, but no one is inside. Confused, Ike takes a few steps forward to analyze the situation, and then the prisoner appears behind him, almost hitting him with a dagger. Without wasting time, the mage strikes the woman down. After that, she asks what he wants, assuming the demon only came to laugh at a defeated enemy. Without falling for the provocation, Ike directly asks if the commander sent an infiltrator to Avelia's to kill him. Alistair doesn't answer, and instead questions if Ike is really a demon. Not understanding why the mage asks what she means, but several guards rush up the stairs upon discovering the invader has reached Commander Alistair's cell. Taking advantage of the intruder's distraction, the woman points the knife at his neck and considers that he might be human for some reason. Holding the wizard hostage, she insists on asking if he is human or not, taking Ike outside the cell as the guards arrive. In response, the commander of the Immortal Brigade freezes time and pushes the guards away with magic. Suddenly, a huge soldier attacks him by surprise. Ike dodges the blow and destroys the floor beneath his opponent, causing him to fall from the top floor of the enormous prison. However, before he falls, Ike casts a spell to cushion the fall and prevent his death. Watching the scene, Alistair wonders why this guy saved the soldier. Unable to move, the officer ends up falling due to the collapsing floor beneath her, but once again, Ike prevents another human's death. Frightened by falling into his lap, Alistair jumps up to stand again, and the wizard tries to calm things down by formally introducing himself. Impressed by his credentials, the woman is amazed to be in the presence of the ruler who defended Avelia's so effectively. Answering the officer's earlier question, Ike says he cannot be human since he commands demonic forces, and soon questions if she sent someone to execute him. Alistair remains undaunted and asserts that she is a knight of the kingdom and will not reveal anything to the demon. If he wants to end her life, so be it. Ike had another plan in mind, so he approaches her to read her mind. Lilith arrives distracted and asks what kind of shamelessness this is. Receiving no response, she says that the guy can have some fun with her instead of this boring human, but Ike ignores the demon until he finishes what he was doing, then turns and leaves. Unsatisfied, Alistair orders the commander to stop and asks what he came there for, to which Ike replies that she need not worry because apparently it has nothing to do with the attempted execution he suffered. The woman argues that she said nothing, so Ike explains that he read her mind and saw nothing suspicious. Finally, he advises the woman to focus on what needs to be done after the defeat they suffered, as that is the most important thing. With that, he distances himself from the confused woman. Lilith invites the boss to relax somewhere before heading home, but the man declines the offer and enters a portal he just created. Upon arriving home, Ike presents Sadie with a portion of rice he bought in the capital plazas, and she asks why. He recalls being told to double the city's taxes and emphasizes that Avelia's has very fertile soil with wheat as the main crop, although rice is much more productive. Sadie shows she doesn't doesn't understand where the young man is going with this, so he elaborates that they could cultivate much more rice in the city, as more productive food could free up some farmers to take on other roles such as joining the army or participating in construction projects. With a greater balance in the division of labor, the city could evolve much faster. As a result, Ike could double taxes without affecting the population's quality of life, while also bringing progress to the region. To symbolize the beginning of this transformation, the ruler asks Sadie to cook the rice he brought, but she has no idea how to do it, having never seen this food before. Ike doesn't know either, but tells the girl to figure it out. All he knows about it is a phrase he once heard: first low, then high, don't lift the lid even if the baby cries. Without understanding any of it, the maid asserts she will do her best. Later, Ike finds the army assembled, and Jiron is curious about why he was ordered to gather everyone. Ike responds that he will know soon enough. Analyzing the attempt on his life, the commander reflects that the arrow someone fired belonged to the enemy army, but Alistair, who was the leader of the attackers, knew nothing about it. This means someone attacked Ike intending to incriminate the Knights of the White Rose, the worst-case scenario he had imagined, as it certainly indicates a spy in his army. Given the facts, he reads the minds of all his warriors, while Jiron admires the boss and his absolute power, eager for him to read even more of his mind. Among the troops, a goblin sweats, nervously fearing discovery. At the same moment, Ike teleports in front of him and accuses the soldier. By nightfall, the commander visits Zephyr after a long time away, a fact the woman makes sure to comment on. Despite being accustomed to seeing his superior bathing, he prefers to wait outside until she is ready. Before leaving the bathroom, she asks if he found the spy, to which he replies it is the second in command of the 7th Battalion, the one-eyed goblin Jace. Zephyr isn't surprised, as she already had her suspicions. Almost lamenting the betrayal, Ike adds that Jace is very intelligent and a veteran warrior. Thus, Zephyr rises from the bath and asserts that this traitor must pay a high price. Among his comrades, the one-eyed creature is informed by his subordinate that the commander visited Zephyr. Jace asks the shooter if he messed everything up since Ike is still alive, but the archer assures him that he pierced the target's chest. Another comrade informs the boss that he cannot contact the Immortal Brigade spy, so Jace deduces he was discovered, thus planning to strike first to avoid being caught off guard. However, as if that weren't enough, Jace is informed by a third ally that Ike himself has come to see him. Upon arrival, the goblin comments that the commander made a point of coming alone. Ike notes that the goblin decided to do the opposite with dozens of soldiers behind him. Therefore, he wants to know if Jace plans to start a war. Jace responds that this is his territory and none of the commander's business. Moreover, he mentions that Ike was injured in the last battle and believes this is due to the commander becoming too confident, which made him careless and unacceptable behavior for the leader of a brigade. As the goblin spoke, his soldiers were steadily closing in on the human. Without losing his calm, Ike agreed with Jace's point of view, because indeed he needed to be more cautious, especially concerning potential traitors. Realizing he had been discovered, Jace smirked and asked what Ike planned to do alone, even though the goblin's one-eyed army was twice the size of the city's military contingent. Moreover, the entire army was eager to taste the blood of the commander. Looking around, Ike was pleased to see all the traitorous soldiers gathered, as it allowed him to kill hundreds of birds with one stone. The method he used was a meteor shower that dispersed the troops. From the dark sky above, Saphiro chanted the spell to keep the flames falling from behind the clouds. However, causing devastation in Avelia's was not part of the plan, so Ike tried to shield himself while regretting involving the sorceress in his plans again, as the idea was to contain the power to minimize the destruction of structures. Then Saphiro ordered her skeleton troops to destroy the enemies mercilessly, while Ike appeared directly behind Jace, offering him two options: surrender peacefully now or surrender after losing everything. Jace chose option C, sending his minions after the mage. Without difficulty, Ike repelled the enemy forces with his vast array of spells, leaving no chance for his opponents to even touch him. As the soldiers advanced toward their target, Jace hid behind a rock, even as his subordinates called for their leader's presence. According to Jace, his servant's job was merely to buy time for his escape. With this in mind, he fled over the city's structures, promising to make Saphiro pay. A huge creature tried to stop the goblin with a punch that sank the roof of a house, but Jace had his tricks to avoid capture, like a smoke bomb that allowed him to evade the giant. Once no one was around, he entered a secret passage leading directly outside the city away from the battle. Confident he had successfully escaped, Jace turned toward the conflict's debris and acknowledged that he had lost this battle, but that the war was just beginning. However, Ike appeared to thwart the goblin's plans, once more nearly hitting him with a fireball. Jace questioned how the commander knew where he was, since only he knew of that path, and Ike explained that his familiar had followed the traitor. Curious, Jace crushed the familiar with his hand and demanded how the mage dared to stand in his way, but Ike seemed unconcerned with the dangers involved. Calmly, he asked the traitor to surrender, but the goblin was willing to take the confrontation to the bitter end. Full of himself, he punched the mage's magical shield while arrogantly announcing his credentials as the vice commander of the 7th Battalion. As a mere punch was no match for the sorcerer's magical shield, Ike counterattacked by binding the traitor. Ironically, Jace remarked that the demon army held Commander Ike in high esteem, and that the goblin had always known the mage had immense talent with unmatched sorcery and intelligence. Reflecting on this, Jace proposed that the two commanders take over the demon lord's army together, since they had spent their lives fighting humans. But on the other hand, the demon lord had never done anything for them. Following demonic instincts, making humans obey and suffer was what brought the greatest joy, but the current lord did not allow her troops to kill without a justified reason, and many members of the army were dissatisfied with this. According to Jace, it seemed that Darrocutan lacked the firm hand necessary to lead such dark forces, and sometimes gave the impression that she didn't even want the position. Thus, they would be doing a favor by dethroning the current ruler, which is why Jace wished for the commander to join them. After the speech, Ike refused the proposal without a second thought, and anticipating this, Jace threw a kunai at his superior. Dodging the blade, Ike froze time again and dismissed the goblin's ridiculous escape attempt. Moreover, Jace had mentioned joining them, so Ike asked if anyone else was aiding the goblin. Jace refused to speak, so Saphiro appeared to torture the traitor until he talked, pulling at his limbs' bindings. Ike asked his superior not to interfere as he wanted to use his own methods, but the sorceress could not tolerate the subordinate's delay in doing what was necessary. With that said, the spy began to show signs of poisoning, prompting Ike to use his antidote spell, but to no avail. This meant Jace had been poisoned by his own comrades, which to Ike was the worst crime possible. Saphiro used Jace's companion's disdain for him to make the goblin talk, as there was no need to stay silent for those who betrayed him. Besides, she assured him that she would avenge him if he revealed who cooperated in the espionage. Jace gave the name of the responsible party before losing his life, and Ike admitted that he felt sorry for the goblin upon seeing him die abandoned, making him think that this feeling of empathy would bring problems someday. After the entire incident, the commander of the Immortal Brigade was summoned by the Demon Lord along with Saphiro, who reported that the mastermind behind the plot was the head of the 3rd Battalion Bastio. Darrocutan demanded proof, so the sorceress explained that Bastio had dragged Jace to his side and was plotting the deaths of the 3 present in the throne room. After hearing Saphiro, the ruler asked for the word of a 4th element who appeared in the room, surprising the 7th Battalion commanders. It was Bastio defending himself by arguing that these two killed the vice commander themselves to frame him because they want to steal the 3rd Battalion for themselves. After all, Saphiro is a witch, and that's something you would expect from one. Upon hearing this insult, Saphiro instinctively exudes her magical power, but Darrocutan asks everyone to calm down. The Lord emphasizes that the more power a demon has, the more they seek. Wealth, glory, influence. This ambition is what makes demons who they are, so it wouldn't make sense for the leader to kill her subordinates for displaying such behavior, otherwise there would be no one left. Having said that, she questions Bastio if he thought she wouldn't uncover the plot he had planned, which surprises the Headless Knight. As for the witch, the Demon Lord acknowledges that her loyalty is true, but says she was responsible for not maintaining the loyalty of her own subordinates. For this reason, both Saphiro and Bastio must be punished according to the code of laws, but Darrocutan doesn't want to lose both commanders in the midst of a war, so she decrees that the situation be resolved through a duel where the winner will be the owner of the truth, because that is how demons should resolve their problems. Later, after receiving the details of the fight, Saphiro explains to Ike that the duel will be conducted with magical creatures known as puppet soldiers. Each commander will represent their army of 50 puppets, but cannot participate in the fight. The commander who defeats defeats all the enemy's puppets wins, and the loser will be executed. Ike questions why something so complicated since a direct combat would be simpler, but apparently Darokuten wants to test the command abilities of her officers. According to Sephiroth, the Demon Lord is a really strange being, but that's not the most eccentric part of the duel. Actually, it is allowed for the commander to choose a substitute to duel in their place, which is why Sephiroth chooses Ike. Indignant Ike emphasizes that the commander's life is in danger, so she should ensure victory herself, but she responds that she decided on the strategy with the highest probability of winning because Ike has already surpassed her in strength. Saying this, she takes her subordinate's hand and entrusts her life to him. Now analyzing the pieces he will have at the time of the confrontation, Ike wishes he hadn't been put in such a delicate position because the burden is immense. By his side, the loyal Jiron asks if everything is okay because the leader has been too quiet, and Ike confesses that he was reflecting on how their battalion's commander is as eccentric as the Demon Lord herself. The orc laughs and agrees, but notes that Ike is no different with his habit of asking subordinates not to kill without reason. Be that as it may, the human was chosen for the fight, and since the facts are already on the table, all that remains is for him to think of a strategy. Jiron complains about the ugly faces of the puppets, and would love to know how to make them fight. According to what was told to Sephiroth's representative in the combat, these puppets follow commands to the letter. Since they all have the exact same strength, the only test is purely command skill. As for the weapons presented in the room, they can be used freely. After that, he goes straight to his office desk to analyze combat strategies, but so far nothing useful has come to mind. Taking advantage of Sadie coming to serve tea, the commander asks her what is the best way to win a battle. Obviously, the maid doesn't know what to say, so Ike keeps provoking a response. He sets up a hypothetical scene where the girl needs to get into a fight, but she cuts him off, saying she prefers to solve her problems with tea rather than with fighting. Ike agrees that this is the best way, but notes that there are people in the world who will force you to fight whether you want to or not. Considering this, he asks how she would fight if necessary, and she says she would use a broom to defend herself, but isn't sure if it would be a good weapon choice. To her surprise, Ike agrees with the maid's viewpoint because a weapon that allows attacking without approaching the enemy is a good choice. A sword is longer than a dagger, and a spear is longer than a sword. Finally, a bow and arrow provide a longer range attack than all the others combined. Distance attack without putting oneself in danger in a fight is always an intelligent strategy, but every worthy opponent is fully aware of this. Sadie comments that her master in Arsenal was passionate about crossbows, and Ike agrees they are easier to use than a bow and also penetrate armor effectively, but that still isn't enough. Just like all the weapons mentioned, the crossbow is well known to everyone, and what Ike needs is something that surprises the enemy. Thinking about this, he considers building firearms, something Sadie doesn't know what it is, so she asks if they are powerful weapons. The commander explains that this is the type of equipment that can be used to hit an opponent hundreds of miles away without allowing for a counterattack. The maid is impressed but doesn't know how the leader will get access to such strong products, so he tells her that the 7th Battalion commander is a very talented alchemist and will surely tell him that there is nothing she cannot do. Upon arriving at Sephiroth, he hears that there are things she cannot do. The human complains that his boss always has this arrogant face and claims she can move mountains, but she replies that she is no deity. Moreover, she has no idea what a firearm is. Losing patience, Ike explains, it's an iron cylinder with gunpowder inside that explodes to propel a projectile. But since the witch is tired of this nerdy talk, she splashes water on her subordinate's face and asks him to join her in the water. Meanwhile, Bastio is also making his preparations for the duel. That night, he learns that Ike will be sent to fight in place of Sephiroth, leading the messenger to believe that she is afraid of his boss. However, Bastio points out that the witch is the commander of the 7th Battalion, so it would be naive to assume she doesn't have a plan. With that said, he praises the sword he's holding, and his subordinate explains that it is made from the fangs of a black dragon and can cut through anything, which is why he will have enough made for all the puppets. However, Bastio desires more than just that. At that moment, an orc arrives after completing a mission and informs the leader that victory is certain. At the same time, Ike steps out of the bath after tirelessly reflecting on the situation he's caught up in. He doesn't want to believe that Saphiro sent him knowing her life is at risk. Suddenly, in the midst of his reflections, Darrokutin appears and sees him without his demon armor, so the boy bows in desperation, hoping she doesn't realize he is Ike since she has never seen him without a mask. Without saying another word, she orders the man to untie a cloth bundle he was carrying. Upon doing so, he sees various firearms. The demon calls out Ike's name, asking if this is what he was looking for, and the commander tries to pretend that's not his name. But she informs him that there is no need to hide anymore because Romberg had already told her that he passed all his knowledge and magic to the human child. Incredulous, Ike asks why he wasn't killed before, and she reveals that despite being extremely powerful, no power is enough without the right allies. Darrokutin seeks people to fight for her to make possible the world she envisions and desires, and believes that Ike is an important addition to her side in the trenches. Observing the weapons provided by the Lord, Ike dares not refuse such a request, so the supreme leader of the demons withdraws. Without wasting time, Ike presents the firearms to Saphiro and asks her to make lead projectiles, to which the witch conjures one that could be a cannonball. Ike comments that she should know that this thing is too big to fit in such a small barrel, but the mage is annoyed at having to do more precise work because this kind of thing ruins her skin. Internally, Ike reflects that this woman must not realize she will die if he loses the fight. At that moment, a hole is blown in the wall by an explosion and a demon emerges from the smoke, coughing profusely. It was Fiorentina, one of Ike's servants, who had created what her boss requested, even though she didn't know exactly what it was. She doesn't understand how sulfur, when mixed with charcoal and saltpeter, could cause an explosion, so Ike explains that this is the concept of gunpowder. Next, Saphiro constructs appropriate ammunition for the firearm, and Ike asks her to reproduce 500 of these projectiles. However, as this type of work harms her skin, the mage asks Fiorentina to handle it. Jiron offers to help with determination, but Ike and the servant ask the orc to stay out of it. The next day, the duel is finally about to begin, and the arena is filled with monsters and demons who eagerly and bloodthirstily watch the combat. From the highest part of the arena, Darrokutin watches the preparations from her throne, while Bastio laughs at Ike for coming to the war with only shields while his puppets have complete armor. Observing the enemy's equipment, Ike asks if Bastio's puppets are holding Damascus steel, which is confirmed by the enemy. It is the strongest of all metals, so tough that it cannot be penetrated by arrows or spears. According to Bastio, this was a gift from the demon lord. Hearing this, the sorcerer looks up to where Darrokutin is and remembers when she said he would be important by her side in the war trenches. Since he was also given a gift, the commander supposes that all she wanted was to offer a fair fight and that there are no favorites in this dispute. At the same time, the lord might be testing Ike by pitting him against such a formidable opponent. Then the event announcer declares the duel start. Bastio orders his archers to fire, killing some puppets who didn't shield themselves in time. Next, the commander of the 3rd Battalion orders his spearmen to advance, and more of the human leader's puppets fall on the battlefield. Holding only shields, the dolls merely defend against the attacks until they can no longer, hence being defeated one by one without a chance to retaliate. Bastio laughs and taunts the enemy to react because the way things are going is boring. Ike doesn't respond to the insult until a gunshot echoes around the arena. The shot kills Bastio's puppet without ceremony, making the commander realize the situation has changed. Soon a line of shooters forms in the rear and opens fire on the opponents, driving Bastio mad with confusion over the enemy's equipment. Not knowing how to react, the 3rd Battalion leader's puppets are slaughtered until none remain. After the fight, Darrokutin approaches the defeated commander and offers him two options. The first is to take his own life for an honorable death, and the second is to be killed by the demon lord herself. The knight chooses a third alternative, one worthy of a demon. With that, the orc archer who had set the trap alongside Bastio shoots at Darrokutin, but she catches the arrow effortlessly. What she didn't expect was that the arrow had an explosive attached to it, which detonates, engulfing everyone nearby. Additionally, other explosives around the arena go off, devastating the packed stands, while the 3rd Battalion launches an ambush and Bastio declares himself the new demon lord. Many years ago, in a dark cave, Romberg wiped out a pack of wolves and found a family torn apart by the animals. Amidst the chaos, there was a small child still alive, protected by the parents who used their own bodies as shields to prevent their child's death. Fast forward to the present day, the 3rd Battalion obeyed Bastio's orders in an attempt to take control of the entire demonic army. Catching the orcs by surprise, the commander's skeletons and goblins wiped out anyone in their path, while Bastio boasted about his strategy, confident that once the demons were under his control, the entire world would be his. Seizing his moment of triumph, Bastio tells Ike that it's not too late to join him, assuring him that victory is certain. In fact, he would even allow the mage to continue controlling the 7th Battalion. Glancing around, Ike observed the orcs in the arena being caught off guard and mercilessly slaughtered by the skeletal troops. He replied that it was an enticing offer, but he wasn't going to discuss it with Bastio. As his staff emanated power, the sorcerer declared that the commander of the 3rd Battalion would not be the demon lord. Hearing this, Bastio laughed, thinking Ike was smarter than that. As he spoke, his soldiers surrounded the mage, and Bastio announced that this would be the end of his enemy. With that, some warriors charged at Ike, who responded with a powerful spell that repelled the attackers. Undeterred, the troop commander ordered the attack to continue, prompting Ike to escalate with an even stronger spell, striking down the soldiers advancing on him. One of the skeletons used its mana-coated skull to explode near the mage, but no significant damage was done. Still, as it was about to complete its strategy of striking with a sword through the smoke, the skeleton was defended by a magical shield and vaporized by another spell. Despite the mage's undeniable dominance in the battle, the 3rd Battalion stood firm under their leader's orders, not retreating in the face of the sorcerer's might. As Ike took flight, the archers seized the opportunity to shoot, but he dodged the projectiles and continued his ascent to a vantage point high enough to overlook the arena. From there, he cast a spell that pierced all the enemy soldiers, leaving Bastio in disbelief. Soon the knight would be the next victim of Romberg's pupil. Flying towards him, Ike unleashed a spell that caused a massive explosion. As the smoke cleared, Ike surveyed the carnage and destruction around him, expecting Bastio to be part of the scene. But the 3rd Battalion leader, his head rolling on the ground, let out another laugh and declared that it wasn't over yet. With that, the Dark Knight's body emerged behind the mage to attack, while the grandstand continued to suffer from numerous explosions that were collapsing the arena. Ike narrowly escaped the attack as the entire environment transformed into a sandstorm. Bastio made it clear that an attack like that couldn't defeat him. In fact, as the head of the Immortal Brigade, Ike should remember that the knight was a Dullahan and that he and his soldiers were undead. Seeing the enemies rise again after being killed, Ike realized that their ferocity hadn't diminished as Bastio's warriors resumed their attack with renewed vigor. This time, the skeletons hurled a larger number of explosive skulls at the opposing mage, who couldn't think of a reaction in time. Adding to that, a zombie goblin approached Ike dangerously, prompting the human to act quickly. He froze the enemy's arm and shattered it into pieces. After that, he stopped time and struck down the closest enemies, but they kept coming. According to Bastio, his troops were endless, and no matter how powerful a sorcerer Ike was, all magic was finite and would eventually run out. Therefore, it was only a matter of time before Bastio claimed victory, which was a pity, as the knight would have loved to have an ally of Ike's caliber by his side. As if that weren't enough, the orc archer who had taken a shot at Darokutin acted again. With his extraordinary aim, he hit the mage with an explosive arrow, causing a massive blast. By luck or reflex, Ike managed to protect himself in time and raised a magical shield, but the shock was enough to show that his life had been on the line. Breathless, the sorcerer finally showed signs of fatigue. Bastio pointed out that the enemy was still alive, acknowledging that this was why he was the leader of the Immortal Brigade. Nevertheless, the knight reiterated that resistance was futile. On the other side, Ike began to believe this was true, so he needed to find a way to turn the tide before the situation worsened. Analyzing his surroundings, he knew that the undead were walking corpses and that his dark magic didn't work against them. However, the very fact that they weren't alive gave the human a good idea. In the meantime, Bastio assumed the enemy's passive stance was a sign of surrender, but he seized the moment to order another charge from his troops, which they promptly executed. Ike responded with a radiant spell that evaporated the attackers, and the light spread across the battlefield battlefield, having the same effect on the remaining enemies. Bastio, never having imagined this, was left speechless. His archer vassal was about to shoot again, but his arm was cut off to halt his momentum. It was Sephiroth finishing her business with the orc by blowing him up completely. Moreover, she brought more soldiers to hold off the 3rd Battalion, including demons under her command, who demonstrated above-average skills massacring opponents and dominating the battlefield with authority. Similarly, Jiron led the battalion's goblins, while Lilith used her peculiar techniques to subdue the adversaries. After defeating the monsters with her allure, she declared that she would now go directly to Ike. Meanwhile, Sephiroth reached the mage first and informed him that the conflict was under control. Practically defeated, Bastio curses the name of Zephyr, but Daracuten, who was observing everything from behind, reminds him that the Black Knight's opponent is Ike. As she approaches the commander of the 3rd Battalion, the Demon Lord gives her subordinate another chance by offering a direct fight against Ike. If he wins, Bastio will have his life spared. Seizing this opportunity, the knight assures that he will tear that mage apart. Without ceremony, the two launch into battle, and the impact of their collision creates a cloud of dust around them. Bastio attacked repeatedly with his sword, while Ike maintained his integrity with his magical shield. However, part of the barrier is broken by the warrior's strength, who now attacks with even more fervor, asserting that Ike's fate is to die right there. He adds that Ike should hate the Demon Lord, who after his victory in the war handed him death as a reward. To end the fight, Bastio unleashes a dark magic against Ike, who responds once again with the luminous spell that decimated the undead troops. This time, the light consumed the dark energy beam coming from the enemy warrior's arm, even taking the demon's hand with it. Watching the fight closely, Zephyr is astonished, as she has no idea when Ike learned to use white magic. Strangely, the sorceress notices that the Demon Lord is not at all surprised by this. Bastio arrogantly charges once more at his rival, who now wielded a white magic that was the key to victory. When he was a boy, one day Ike was staring sadly at a dead flower. His master Romberg then invited the boy to the day's magic studies. Showing talent from a young age, Ike diligently attended the lessons that were part of his daily routine alongside the Guardian of Hell. Later that day, the boy asked if there was a spell that could bring a withered flower back to life, and the experienced teacher explained that white magic was responsible for that. Without hesitation, Ike asked to learn this branch of sorcery, but Romberg stressed that the boy was now a demon, so he should study curses, not white magic. This was because it would be highly suspicious for Ike to use such an ability, as white magic draws its power from compassion from a pure heart that cares for others. Obviously, this was something that would not please the demons if they saw it manifest in Ike. However, if the human insisted on learning, considering that he must hide it at all costs, Romberg revealed that white magic is more terrifying than any blade for those who possess demonic power. Faced with this, Ike did not give up the idea. Now, as a full-fledged mage, Ike mocks Bastio by saying that becoming a demon lord is too ambitious for someone like him. After all, Bastio didn't mind sacrificing his soldiers, even if they were undead, and was willing to turn against his comrades and his lady for his own ambition. Ike admits that this is how a demon should be, but it is precisely for this reason that he will not forgive the enemy for his crimes, as a ruler cannot oppress his people. Bastio becomes enraged by this speech, as if he needed to be forgiven by someone who in his mind is insignificant. Filled with hatred, he attacks again, and Ike apologizes to his grandfather for having to use white magic. With his left claw illuminated, the young human pierces the demon's torso, causing the light to spread and consume Bastio's body until he disappears. As soon as the fight is over, Zephyr asks if Ike learned to do that from Romberg, which he confirms. Impatiently, the human asserts that the woman knew everything and still left him to take the front line. Laughing shyly, Zephyr affirms that even so the boy came out winning. However, Daracuten now has a problem, as there is no one to lead the 3rd Battalion, so she hands this regiment over to Ike. Informing him of her decision, the Demon Lord leaves. Lilith and Jiron arrive to celebrate the leader's victory and survival despite the demoness dying of jealousy over the orc's embrace of the boy. Later, Zephyr confronts the Supreme Leader for having removed her vice commander from her command. As Ike's commander, she imagined that she would be the only one capable of dictating the subordinate's path. Daracuten is surprised by the sorceress's negative reaction, as she thought she would agree with this decision. In any case, following the same logic as Zephyr, Daracuten is the superior of both, so she has the final say in any decision. Regardless, the Lord summons Ike to speak for himself himself and make his own choice. After the meeting with Daracuten, Zephyr scolds the mage for letting the Lord know he is human, but becomes even more irritated to see that the man does not even show anxiety about it. A few minutes earlier, Ike had told the Lord that people are beginning to get used to the new Evalias. Initially, the demons did not know how to coexist with humans, but this has been changing gradually to the point where all races live in harmony and work together for the common good and development of the region, something previously unthinkable under any circumstances. Even the youngest inhabitants of Evalias have already lost their fear of the beings once called monsters, and this unity that has been created is without a doubt something special that has emerged in this city. When he started serving Zephyr, Ike made it clear to the commander that his greatest life goal is to help create a world where humans and demons can coexist peacefully. With that said, Ike removes his mask and apologizes for what he has decided, but declares that he still has much to learn from Zephyr. In return, he promises to make Evalias the first city where the two races can live in peace. After Ike and Zephyr leave, Daracuten reflects at her window on the meaning of everything she has just heard. Just like that, next to Sadie, Ike observes the distant landscape of the city he governs the following day. Excited, he is confident that the soil and climate of Evalias allow them to use the Norfolk system, a farming method that lets them grow various types of food without leaving the field vacant. With this, Sadie gets thrilled knowing she can eat turnips until she's full. Speaking of which, Ike would love for all the inhabitants to be very busy building a place where races can live together in harmony. On the other hand, this harmony is nothing more than a fairy tale on the front lines of the war between humans and demons, where violence is the only path that opens up before the combatants and the victims of this bloody clash. Away from the incessant conflict, Ike uses his magic to summon rain and revolutionize farming in Evalias. In the past, the most well-known technique was to grow wheat and then let the field rest, creating pasture for the cattle. Now, to avoid leaving the field vacant for so long, they will grow barley, wheat, clover, and turnips simultaneously, always keeping the field occupied. Using this method, humans and demons will never run out of food. With these final words, the citizens of Evalias who were following the implementation of the Norfolk technique celebrated around their leader Ike. Later, Sadie serves tea to the governor and congratulates him on becoming the vice commander. Suddenly, Jiron bursts into the leader's office in a panic, calling him by name. Sadie corrects the orc, saying the leader should be addressed by his title, so the subordinate apologizes profusely for his lack of decorum and accepts any punishment. Speaking of which, stumbling over his words, the monster finds it curious that Ike refused the position of commander of the army corps. Tired of the assistant's random chatter, the mage asks him to get to the point, so Jiron alerts him that the Alliance of Kings started to take action the previous night. The Second Army Corps, which was trying to take Alesta, was destroyed, and no one ever imagined that such an experienced and powerful battalion could be defeated the way it was. Sadie asks what the Alliance of Kings is, so Ike explains that it is an ancient human treaty. When the Demon Lord's army becomes too strong for one nation to face alone, all the countries on the continent unite to face the threat together. This treaty has occurred 3 times in the past, and every time the demons were defeated. To make matters worse, Evalias will likely be the next target of the human alliance, because besides being a border region with enemy kingdoms, it is a strategic territory due to containing Arsenam, a very important base. Aware of this, Ike imagines that this union among men can turn the tide in their favor, especially if they retake Arsenam. If this happens, the monster army will be forced to retreat to Doberberg, where the Demon Lord's castle is, and will certainly be cornered. At the same time, Ike's dream of creating a city where both races can live in harmony will go down the drain. To prevent this from happening, the mage assesses that there is only one way to overcome these overwhelming numbers. Moments later, in a meeting with his 2 commanders, Fiorentina held a firearm in her hands after discovering that it is impossible to produce this weapon with alchemy, because with just one shot the weapon breaks. Therefore, there is a clear limit to what alchemy can do in terms of the durability and precision of weaponry. Zephyr questions if they can simply destroy the enemy with magic, but Ike fears that his superior will devastate the entire city, so he prefers to arm the population and organize a defense that does not destroy the defender's home. Regarding this, Fiorentina suggests that they assemble the metal and wood parts one by one to build the rifles. Knowing that these parts are small and intricate, the demon advises seeking the dwarves to provide this service. Zephyr considers the idea, but remembers that this race lost the war against humans and now wanders the world separately, and this task would require a large number of them. To gather the necessary amount, Ike believes the hope lies in rescuing the dwarf king who is imprisoned in the kingdom of Isma. The name of this supreme leader is Gunther. During the war, humans had devastated the dwarven cities and left the chief of that race kneeling before the death of almost all his kind. Despite the certain defeat and humiliation, the dwarf king ensures that he will not allow humans to use dwarf technology for war. However, circumstances prevent the defeated ruler from making any demands, and in the end he has no choice, especially since his own son Batson is being held hostage by humans to get what they want from the enemy race's leader. The humans want the dwarves to use their skills for Isma because only then will they allow the defeated to live. Long after the surrender, Gunther spent his long days in the cell wondering how his son and the others were doing. Suddenly, he hears several laughs from the guards outside the bars, and upon seeing what was happening, the soldiers seem dazed by some strange enchantment or drunkenness, and a demon appears to open the dwarf's cell with the key. The dwarf questions why a demon would help him, but Lilith doesn't have time to tell the whole story. As the rescued insists on hearing a justification, even aggressively demanding it, the demon casts the same spell on him that she cast on the guards. Jiron asks what's going on, and Lilith has no fear in replying that she got fed up with the bearded guy screaming in her ear. With that said, she leaves without saying goodbye, while Jiron ends up stating alone that this guy she knocked out is simply the supreme leader of an entire race. Carrying the rescued one on his shoulders, the orc is relieved not to see guards in the corridors as they escape. On the other hand, Lilith laments not having anyone to play with so far. Jiron reminds her that the orders are to rescue the prisoner without being noticed, but in truth Lilith doesn't care much about orders. Ignoring the orc's words, she smells something strange coming from him, making Jiron worried and asking what smell she sensed. Just to tease the monster, the demon replies that it's the scent of pig ugliness, provoking the orc's anger. In the midst of this, guards passed through the corridor and found the fugitives, so they attack without wasting time. Happy as can be, Lilith plans to have a good meal with the two young men. Using her mysterious magic powder, she knocks out the guards, while Jiron remembers that the order was not to get involved in unnecessary fights. Apparently, the loyal assistant to the vice commander still hasn't realized that the demoness doesn't care about orders, almost bringing the orc to tears before he says he'll tell their superior everything. Meanwhile, another guard was passing by in the corridor and attacked Jiron, who impulsively defends himself with a punch, causing the man's head to hit the iron door. Lilith turns the tables, saying she'll turn the orc in, making him beg like a child afraid of punishment. Shortly after, at the dungeon exit, the infernal duo runs into an entire battalion of men who, upon realizing what's happening, start gathering around the invaders. Lilith doesn't stand idle in the face of the circumstances, and since she promised Ike she wouldn't kill anyone, she continues to defeat her enemies in her own way. Watching the situation from a distance, upon seeing her method, Ike grumbles that his order was not to be seen, but apparently Lilith isn't very good at stealth. On the contrary, there's an entire regiment chasing the duo sent on this mission. To end this circus, the mage conjures a barrier to separate the men from the monsters and approaches Lilith and Jiron to tell them they did a good job. As emotional as always, the demoness thanks her master for the help and offers a kiss in return, but Ike declines the offer as expected. He then sees Jiron with the dwarf on his shoulder and remarks that this isn't how a king should be carried. Panicking at the scolding, the orc starts spinning the guy around to wake him up, but he was in another world. Seeing Gunther awake the next day, Ike places a firearm in his hand and states that he would like more of these weapons to be produced. Gunther had never seen anything like it, but believes it's possible to make more, though it will probably take a long time. The issue is he refuses to cooperate with the demons, whom he sees as no different from humans, only wanting to use the dwarves for their selfish ends. For this reason, he'd rather die than become a slave. That said, Ike understands the dwarf king's reasoning, but promises to show him that Avelia's is a city unlike any other. When taken outside, Gunther sees men and demons working together and can't believe his eyes. Ike explains that his plan is to create a society where these races, always seen as enemies, can thrive in harmony, but for that he needs the help of the dwarves' highest leader. This philosophy of life pleases Gunther without a doubt, but his many years of experience make him hesitate to help men again. After all, humans destroyed everything important to the dwarves, forcing their race to wander the world without a place to call home, as the homeland where the dwarves put down roots turned to ashes. To convince Gunther, Ike promises to ask the demon lord to rebuild the dwarven kingdom once the firearms are ready. However, the king becomes furious, finding this statement very arrogant, as a dwarven kingdom can only be built by many dwarves, and if there's one thing scarce in this current world, it's his people who were chased and killed until only nomads and beggars remained scattered across the continent. Without losing his composure, Ike decides to show in practice that it won't just be talk. Taking Gunther to the forge, the king sees Batson, his son, along with several other dwarves he thought dead. They all say the demons saved them and gave them food and beds to keep them from dying. With their king present, the dwarves are motivated to work even harder to achieve their goals in this war. Taking advantage of the emotion of seeing his people working together again, Ike asks Gunther once more if he would like to cooperate. This time, the king clearly does not object, as he has never been closer to his roots than now in a long time. When greeting the ruler of Avelias, the dwarf feels a strange warmth from his hand, a warmth a demon shouldn't have. Later, seeing his master return, Sadie offers him tea, but he prefers that the servant rest a bit. He advises her to take some free time to read something instead of just working, but the girl never learned to read. Moved by this, Ike promises to teach her. At this moment, Lilith arrives, announcing she has brought back all the dwarves scattered throughout Arsenam. However, seeing the two so close to each other, she throws a fit, thinking the maid is flirting with her master. Sadie gives a mocking look and responds that she's just doing her job, and since Lilith doesn't buy it, the two butt heads. As if that weren't enough, now Jiron arrives in a rush as usual. Meanwhile, a human soldier informs his general that the dwarf king was rescued by the demons, and the officer is curious to know what the monsters plan to achieve with that old man. At the same moment, another messenger returns to report that Avelias has about 500 soldiers at the moment, but the brigade commanders are expected to support the city, so these numbers are likely to increase. Thus, the general questions how many men his subordinate managed to gather. When the knight replies that his army is 12,000 strong, the general smiles and announces that it's time to act. The next day, Jiron was climbing a cliff with the grace of a pig despite his master's encouragement. According to the servant, it's easy for the mage to talk because he can use his spells to climb in the blink of an eye. A human on the mission helps Jiron take the final step to the top, while Ike is pleased that the assistant is getting quality exercise, though Jiron feels he's lost a few years of his life in the process. To the orcs' relief, they can see the cave that was today's destination from there. Inside, the mage is delighted to find natural saltpeter. With this resource combined with the dwarves' talent, they could advance the project of building weapons for the war, potentially turning the tide for Avelias. As days pass, training begins for the local forces with firearms in hand. Using war tactics known by the human disguised in the battalion, the goblins fire and amaze Jiron, who never imagined seeing such a powerful shot produced by that heap of resources. But it wasn't just the city's fighters the leader could count on. Monster races scattered throughout the region had heard of Avelias' recent victories and gathered with the 7th Battalion's commander. The chiefs of these races were impressed to learn that Ike pays the humans of Avelias to work, which was previously unthinkable, as the only language known in this land was that of slavery. Next, a representative of a gargoyle species appeared in Ike's room. Being an old friend of the commander, the monster insisted on referring to him by his title, but the human preferred to be called by his name, which was also uncommon according to the hierarchical respect rules of any military junta in this world. Officially starting the meeting after the last guest's arrival, Fiorentina announced that Zephyr had left the deputy commander in charge of everything in this battle. The troll agreed with this, while the wolfman commented that Ike had been able to destroy Bastio, which was a significant feat. Therefore, the gargoyle joined the chorus, and the three monster races united with Avelias' trenches against the invasion. However, the last chief to join the war reminded them that the enemies had 12,000 men in their army while they had only 2,000. The wolf leader thought it was easy for each fighter to kill 6 enemies, but Ike admitted that not everyone was as skilled as the werewolf brigade, so they needed to devise a strategy that would make a difference in the conflict given the numerical disadvantage. Speaking of which, the gargoyle recommended attacking the opponents at night because darkness had been a monster ally since the beginning of time, but Ike knew the enemies were prepared for this, certainly using light and and detection spells to avoid being caught off guard. Considering this, even though the enemy's numbers were absurdly large, the commander believed the fall would be equally significant. Given the enemy's confidence, Ike wanted them to attack, and when the humans' morale was at its peak, Evalia's would crush the rival forces with all its might. This had to be done quickly and cleanly to avoid as many casualties as possible for future conflicts. Meanwhile, the humans gathered their massive numbers for a frontal assault. Sadie and Jiron organized some gear and cleaned the chief's office so he could focus on the strategies to be developed. The maid commented that the castle was quite agitated with all this mobilization, and Ike was curious about the girl's lack of fear in mentioning the war. According to Sadie, her confidence in Evalia's troops made her feel more at ease. In her mind, the local forces were made up of individuals of good character, which the ruler agreed with. The maid intended to help as much as she could when the battle began, such as feeding the soldiers to keep morale high and their bellies full. Thanks to the Norfolk system Ike implemented in local agriculture, Evalia's was full of provisions and wouldn't struggle when it came to food. With this in mind, the commander thought of a meal that could be an essential ally on the front lines, and considering they harvested a lot of rice, he suggested making fried rice for the fighters, as it was easy to prepare and nutritious. Without ceremony, Sadie got to work and learned on the fly how to make this ration for the military based on egg, salt, vegetables, greens, and meat pieces. In the end, she was proud of her work, as was Ike. But when they were about to taste the food that would be a reference in the trenches, Jiron came running and prevented the ruler from revealing his identity. The orc had smelled it from afar and didn't think it was fair for them to eat without him, so another plate was set for the leader's assistant. Next, Lilith also approached and didn't want to miss out on the experience, so another meal was placed on the table. Thus, while everyone ate with joy in their eyes, Ike ended up just watching, unable to remove his mask. After eating everything, Lilith asked for another portion, so Sadie served a well-filled plate. The demon looked at the human with disdain because it was evident that Sadie wanted to fatten Lilith. As a result, the two continued their rivalry with electric barbs. Jiron found it strange that his master wasn't eating the fried rice, so Ike had to lie that he would try it later. To change the subject, he asked the assistant how it tasted, and the orc confessed that he was amazed while he gulped down more food, leaving Ike with an expression that under the mask would undoubtedly be the same as a starving orphan in a cold alley of Doberberg. After this, the army commander saw his troops gathered and his wall built in record time. Now it was just a matter of putting everything planned into practice. As hours passed, the orc on watch noticed the arrival of endless waves of men marching toward Evalia's, so the trumpets sounded and the mobilization for the confrontation began once and for all on the brink of a bloodbath. Within the walls, the population reaches a peak of distress upon hearing the sound that precedes terrible news. As the goblins take their positions with rifles in hand, Gunther, the dwarf king, utters a silent prayer to invoke luck for his comrades, while the brigade of werewolves, trolls, and gargoyles prepare for the onset of war. Rushing as usual, Jiron bursts into the chief's office to announce what has just happened, prompting Sadie to wish the supreme commander of the army good luck. Taking command of the wall, the wizard watches the enemy troops marching toward his city as the night follows the steady steps of the humans. He then reminds his fighters that if Evalia's falls, the alliance forces will gather around Arsenam, and this must be prevented at all costs. With that said, the monstrous forces within the city's walls scream and roar to boost their morale, a volume that can be heard by the human general, who despite this feels frustrated to see that the resistance of Evalia's is much weaker than he thought. The officer beside him notes that furthermore the best warriors from each region are concentrated in the human army, at this very moment practically guaranteeing victory. Among the human machinery, catapults and ballistae are positioned to devastate the enemy wall, and indeed the men's morale is as high as possible under the circumstances. According to the general, this will not be a war, but an extermination of this horde of monsters. With that, he orders the massacre to begin, and the endless lines of men march toward the attack along with the machinery firing their heavy projectiles at the enemy's defenses. But instead of instantly toppling the wall of Evalia's, a protective magic surrounding the perimeter prevents the impact, which does not shake the human general's resolve, who orders another barrage. barrage. Again, catapults and ballistae fire at the city, but the magical shield absorbs the damage once more. With this, Ike is pleased that the enemy has taken his bait. Lilith takes the opportunity to flirt with the most incredible commander of Romberg, but he warns that flattery gets you nowhere, leaving the demoness looking foolish. Regardless, the wizard cannot predict the allied army's next move, so all that remains is to wait. Thus, the humans persist with the same strategy, but the projectiles strike the barrier once again. Jiron and Lilith begin to mock the enemy's lack of intelligence, but Ike notices some magical intervention in the enemy trench that nullifies his spell and leaves his wall vulnerable. Below, wizards unite to cast the spells necessary for this to happen, and with the strategy's success, Unit 1 is ordered to advance. The facts are on the table. Ike needs to think quickly to avoid the annihilation of his people. Jiron alerts that the riflemen are ready, but the commander orders them to hold fire to make way for the giant. Massive boulders are hurled at the enemy lines, crushing a large number of men who are vulnerable to the goblins' arrows. With their shields, they protect themselves as best they can, but the rocks are literally unavoidable and continue to spill human blood on the front line. The Alliance responds in kind, shooting arrows at the walls of Evalia's, while Ike tries to control the battle with his magical interventions in a personal duel against the human wizards. Soon, the first Alliance unit reaches the edge of the wall and throws up their ladders to initiate the frontal assault, while goblin archers try to prevent the advance alongside trolls who hurl stones at the opponents. Next to the general, the second in command admits that the monsters are giving more trouble than expected, but that none of this will prevent victory. The general only thinks about what's for dinner, underestimating Evalia's resistance against his overwhelming attack. To expedite his favorite meal of the day, he orders the catapults to be fired exclusively. The subordinate officer points out that the allied men will be hit, but the general does not care about that. As soon as the order is obeyed, Ike tries to block the impact once again, but his spell is nullified by the enemy wizards. With this, the devastation is widespread, turning the battlefield into total chaos, where monsters, demons, and men are flung into the air by the Supreme Leader's ruthless assault. Fighting for his life, Jiron manages a moment to raise his head and witness the deaths of all those who took the front line of this war, which is becoming increasingly horrifying. Not even the demons approved of such a vile measure to achieve victory. Ike, who once controlled his strategy to prevent the enemy's advance, now gazes at the destruction around him, with all those who worked day after day alongside him to build a more united and strong Evalia's now dead at his feet. This sight fills the wizard with rage, while the human general flashes a smile at the success of his deplorable tactic. Even so, there is no time to look back, so the deputy commander of the attack orders the second unit to advance. Using the breaches in the wall as entry points, the men collide with the resistance forces orcs, who fire in response to the imminent invasion. As the tide increasingly turns in favor of the Alliance, Ike grips his scepter with growing strength, anger, and fear, faced with the real danger of Evalia's turning to ruins before his eyes. Meanwhile, Sadie maintains her courage as she tends to the wounded fighters who are becoming more numerous. Wiping the sweat from her brow, her once unshakable hope begins to fracture as the city is overrun. On the human side, the general in charge of the offensive sips his tea, calmly certain that his victory will come sooner or later. He orders the third unit to attack, adding even more enemies against the resistance of Evalia's, which was already suffering from numerical inferiority. Ike notices that things are moving faster than he expected, so he needs to stay alert if he wants everything to go as planned. The monsters that could be rescued in time were brought to the makeshift first aid unit, where Sadie tried to maintain her focus and, most importantly, keep the few combatants alive. On the front line, Lily and the other demons dealt with the enemy soldiers, who were swarming like ants over the breach in the wall. After defeating yet another opponent, Lily sees the third unit arriving with all its strength intact. Fiorentina takes the rear and orders her troops not to let the enemy pass, while Jiron positions himself with the goblins armed with firearms, terrified of hitting his allies in the midst of that chaotic mess. Suddenly, the werewolves appear to to take the vanguard, using their claws and teeth to make significant advances for Avelia's lines. They gain reinforcement from ferocious, extremely powerful monsters to contain the threat. Alongside them, the goblins armed with rifles fire from the top of the walls, surprising the men trying to invade who had never seen such equipment before. Faced with this, the third unit of the alliance had no choice but to retreat as the werewolves subdued their opponents with great skill, giving them no chance. Amid the fleeing men, the wolves hear a trumpet from Avelia's. On the day of the war meeting, Ike had said this battle needed to be quick, clean, and with minimal casualties. The monsters of course agreed, but they couldn't imagine how this could be achieved given their visible disadvantage. Without going into more detail, the mage just states that each of them should fight with all their strength. Bayo, the leader of the werewolves, sees this as a mockery from the vice commander of the 7th Battalion, but Fiorentina asks for silence to hear what the chief has to say, as there is surely a reason behind his words. Indeed, Ike explains that there is a way to achieve this. In the midst of the human alliance's attack, the demon invokes an alchemy skill called Devil's Thorns, a tangle of thorns that when thrown on the ground spreads to close the breach in the wall. In the meeting, Ike asked how long Bayo could fight with all his strength, and the leader of the werewolf brigade presumed about an hour, though most of his unit would probably be eliminated well before that. Thus, Ike negotiates for Bayo to fight for only 10 minutes no matter what, and then retreat. According to Bayo, this he can promise without a doubt. After launching the Devil's Thorns, Fiorentina smiles, seeing the strategy working. After the wolves retreat, it's now the troll's turn to break through the human alliance's forces. The demon complains that she worked to close the wall just for these brutes to destroy everything again. Moreover, she remembers Ike said part of the plan was for their allies not to follow the plan, but she doesn't exactly know what that meant, so she just goes with the flow and trusts the leader. Meanwhile, the troll's chief demands his unit to massacre the humans without mercy, which indeed happens because the difference in strength between the races was enormous, giving the impression that not even one troll would die in this clash. Days earlier, Ike stipulated that once Bayo retreated, Gamos would step in with his giant warriors. The werewolf feels offended, thinking the sorcerer doesn't trust the lupines to keep fighting, so Gamos asks for silence as he's beginning to understand where the commander is headed. Ike wants his allies to work in shifts just like they did when fixing the gates. Bayo asks someone to explain what that means, so the sorcerer emphasizes that the more one fights, the more one wears out. Therefore, the plan is to attack in shifts to confuse and exhaust the enemy, while Avelia's forces take turns and preserve some of their energy to maintain full strength. Implementing the established strategy, Gamos awaits the next step, while a man climbs the wall and is about to kill Fiorentina, who is saved by Jiron and his rifle. On that pre-war day, though he understood the strategy, Bayo contested its effectiveness because the humans' numerical superiority was too overwhelming. But that's precisely why Ike ordered Fiorentina's alchemy and Jiron's riflemen to be prepared to level the playing field. As strategic units capable of changing the course of the battle, they must attack at a single point on the battlefield. In fact, the breach in the wall will be deliberately opened to attract the enemies to this location. Speaking of which, the commander asks if the alchemist is ready for war, and she responds that her orders are the orders of Zephyr, and she is willing to sacrifice her life to follow them. On the other hand, the mage asks the demon not to try to sacrifice her life, just as he asks everyone present and the others to do the same. After all, the strategy's goal is to minimize casualties, keeping as many combatants alive as possible. Amid the battle, after seeing the wall rebuilding, the humans prepare the catapults and ballistas to open another breach, but the gargoyles spring into action, throwing stones from the sky to destroy the weapons from a distance. Curious about his role in the battle, the leader of these monsters had heard that he was responsible for destroying the enemy's siege weapons. Ike calculated that the humans would have 1,000 soldiers available, not counting reserve forces. Their general comes from a long line of nobles, and is a coward who cares more about his well-being than his army. In other words, if he feels the tide of war turning against him, this general will act rashly, and it is then that the monsters must capture him. Regarding this, Ike will personally take care of the matter, so he asks that no one take action on their own in this respect. With that said, all the leaders present embrace the idea of the immortal brigade commander and feel confident that the defense will succeed in their endeavor. Once put into action, the plan really seemed to have turned the tide for the monsters in this war. The desperate looks that had gripped the forces of Avelia's were now replaced surprised by sparks of hope as Ike's strategy began to work. Fiorentina hoped that Zephyr was also safe amidst all this. As the meeting was nearing its end, she wanted to know about the commander as well. The deputy informed her that the commander was tasked with another mission, probably the most important one of all, delaying the human rear guard. Already in action on the day of the battle, Zephyr spotted the leader of the human soldiers and could almost taste him in her mouth. Meanwhile, the front line had turned into chaos for the human alliance, watching their soldiers being crushed by the brute force of the monster races in an overwhelming manner. It was a far cry from the reality the general had instilled in his men before the conflict. At this point, the general was informed that his units 2 and 3 had been decimated by the enemy. He wiped the smug smile off his face, replaced by an expression of anger and surprise at the unexpected response from Evelius. The deputy advised the troops to retreat, but the general demanded an all-out attack, stating that if winning with 5-1 wasn't possible, then make it 10. And if 10 weren't enough, let each monster fight 20 men at the same time. After all, the noble general thought about how his prestige would suffer if he failed to conquer a small domain with 1-2 Zhezhens and men under his command. And speaking of which, he would join the troops himself to boost their morale. Thus, the deputy general gave the order, and the soldiers prepared for a total attack. Their shouts echoed off the walls of Evelius, reaching the ears of the defending monsters. Jiron wondered if the humans weren't afraid of what was happening, and Fiorentina thought they were a bunch of fools believing their end was near. Then, as if the demoness had cursed them, the very ground of the battlefield opened up, separating Evelius from the Alliance's forces. The units in combat wondered how the sorcerers allowed this to happen, but the goblins had subdued the mages to create this breach. Amidst the incessant tremor, the human general fell from his horse, which fled, leaving the leader on foot. Nearby was Ike, enraged that some of his men had died just to locate the cowardly Alliance officer. The commander of the 7th Battalion declared that the war would end if the general died, because his soldiers wouldn't care about this battle if their leader perished. Even so, Ike promised to spare the general's life if he decided to retreat. The human leader stood up again and questioned who would give the retreat order if he died. At that moment, Gunther appeared out of nowhere, shouting that there was no other option but to defeat the spoiled brat in golden armor. Without any talk or hesitation, the king of the dwarves swung his axe at the human who coughed up blood from the gaping wound in his torso. Gunther didn't miss the chance to ask if the human knew who he was, but just as he was about to end the duel, Ike used his magic to chain the dwarf. Blinded by rage, Gunther strained against the magical chains to finish off the man, almost breaking them, until the general finally surrendered and promised to retreat his troops. Soon the men were seen running for their lives across the horizon of Evelius, though Gunther was certain they would return soon. Nevertheless, the dwarf felt grateful to Ike, but was sure he would regret letting the enemy general alive, which Ike disagreed with, believing Evelius would be much stronger by then. With the departure of the enemy alliance, the monsters celebrated the victory alongside the humans of the city, all impressed at having withstood a force 10 times larger than their own. Meanwhile, Jiron ran crying to embrace his chief, leaving Lilith jealous and ready to pull the orc off the commander. Finally, Sadie joined the chorus, struggling to stay close to Ike. Nearby, the monster leaders gathered and understood why Zephyr had appointed her deputy to this command. Bayo was so impressed that he commented that Ike could have won this war alone, but Fiorentina made a point to emphasize that her chief had said this strategy could only succeed because he had companions he could trust. Moreover, the mage had declared before the start that this conflict was over before it even began. However, there was still one piece on the board out of formation. Zephyr, surrounded by the rear guard with their spears pointed at her, was released by the human officer. He approached the sorceress slowly on his horse until he was at an uncomfortable distance from an enemy who was certainly not one of the weakest, having faced so many men alone. Nevertheless, he heard the retreat shouts from the front line and let out a brief sigh. Zephyr remarked that he managed to get out alive. He affirmed that he would see the mage again and withdrew with his men. After observing the surroundings of Evelius free of enemies, Zephyr contemplated the sunrise, noting that at this rate Ike would soon be the favorite in the eyes of Derakuten. From atop the city's wall, the commander of the Immortal Brigade removed his mask for a moment, letting his human face breathe, taking advantage of the solitude. If you're enjoying this journey, don't forget to hit that like button. Your support helps motivate me to keep bringing you each episode. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. See you in the next episode.